So I think you've had enough of my close-up face. So since this is what I'm reviewing, I'm going to focus there. I took a break in between, like I said, so let's just jump in fresh with the blow up of the first period of the Bible timeline, which is the early world. This is just a big blow up of the beginning of the timeline. As you can see in the narrative books to read is Genesis 1 through 11, and then the next band is the supplemental books, and there are none for the early world. And then the next band are the covenants, which I love, and that's one of the threads through the entire book. So let's see. So that makes it cohesive. And in the early world, as you can see, there are 2 covenants. And as you go along, the covenants include more and more people to finally include us at the end, towards the end. So the first 2 covenants are one holy couple, Adam, and he talks about where in Genesis we'll find that. And then the next covenant, one holy family, and where we'll find that in Genesis. Then the next band goes where the scenes in Genesis took place. As you can see here, the northern countries, moves down to the Canaan, and talks about Jesus' genealogy. I just told you all that. And then he goes into the summary I call the trailer. And it gives a rich, condensed understanding of where you're going in the story. And then the narrative, which is the outline, but it is written where he brings it, how he ties together in the story further down the line after Genesis to put this book into perspective. It's so interesting how he does it. It's literally like magic where he pulls this all together. And then he goes into the significance of human dignity and purpose. And then he ends that portion in how we find first the creations, the drama, and the redemption. And he goes into the significance of human dignity. And then he talks about the covenants and what covenant actually is. So that is real interesting. And he ends that portion in how we find our true purpose and fulfillment in communion with God and others, making a gift of ourselves in love. And it's just beautiful. Then he kind of zooms out a little bit, talks about the creation as a cosmic temple. I showed you that. And he zooms in again with the drama of sin and how this plays out today. And then he goes into redemption and the new creation. And I'm telling you, it's just so rich that it's literally like eating ice cream. I just love his descriptive words and the way he puts it all together. He's just such a good teacher. And then we get into the section of the threads of the covenant, and again the writing on the covenants is just rich and beautiful, that it made me recognize how much God loved me, and he puts us here. He puts here when we violate God's law, our covenants, we hurt ourselves in the process, and we all know that. And he just shows how these laws that he gives us don't restrict us. They actually make us flourish. And rejecting them does not lead to freedom, but to slavery. And he gives an example of that, which is something I think every person is going to relate to. It's just so good. And then he shows us where in the covenants it pulls us all together from the saints all the way up to today, and how you are included, and it's just so beautiful. And then by the time I'm ready to read the actual Bible, I'm fully clued in. I know where I'm going with it. I understand where it fits in. So that's why this program is so holistic. And he shows how they build, the covenants build. And he talks specifically about the first covenant. And then we get into Genesis. So finally, I start reading the actual Bible, which some people might say, well, why don't you just read the actual Bible? But without all that understanding from Jeff, it's confusing, and you have to figure out where everything fits in the context of the entire story, which he does for you. So again, this is the best Bible to actually read the Bible on the whole and not just use it as piecemeal and figuring everything out. So then as I was reading, I just noted some places where things stood out to me, and that's kind of what I'm going to go into my personal reflection of. But at the top of the page, he in the beginning, he puts the key event that we begin with. So I like that because, again, it reminds me of the whole story. So the first thing that stood out to me almost right away is God made the firmament. I'd never heard that word before. And when I was completed in my reading, as Jeff suggested, I took note, and as Jeff suggested, looked it up, and that stood out to me. And what it means is, so I kind of just underlined it just to remind myself. And what it means is heaven or the sky, especially when regarded as a tangible thing. That was so amazing. The second day, God created the sky. And so that I went along and numbered the days, and I just put a little 2 next to the second day in my blue pen. I did the 1, the 2, and then the next thing that stood out to me was on the 4th day, and when he created the stars and the lights. And I never knew that, I never knew it actually says, let them be for signs, which of course we know that points to the stars the star that leads the wise men to Jesus. So already on the first page, as Jeff Cavins shows, this is always setting us up to have God, and it touches us through Jesus. And that was just so fascinating to me. It's setting us up to Jesus. So then the next 2 key elements come up in the book. At the top, he writes them. So again, it orients you. So the next 2 of Genesis. And again, this gives us perspective and helps me to feel like I know where I'm going. And I'm not lost here. I know exactly where I'm going, what's going on in context. So then the next thing that stood out to me in Genesis 2, it was that God so blessed, and it was the 7th day. God so blessed the 7th day and hallowed it, which immediately, of course, made me think of Halloween. So I underlined it to look up later and reflect on a little bit. And when I looked it up, of course, we know it means made holy and consecrated, hallowed ground, recently revered, greatly revered and honored. So that's what God wants us to do on Sundays. And yes, of course, we know this, but reading this just shows me the source of where that came from. And it gives me such a satisfaction, similar to like an anchor or a hook. So then further, what stood out to me was, therefore man leaves his father and his mother, and he clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. And the man and his wife both naked and not ashamed. And then for me, being the mother of adult children, it reminds me of what I always say to my son when he tells me what he and his wife are doing and what their plans are. And it's sort of that breaking of the umbilical cord. Now that they've been married like 10 years, but this is always the way I felt, that sort of, again, gives me that anchor and that hook of where I know that my place is to step back. And although I'm a single mother, I'm not the father and the mother, I am the mother. So your children leave you and go to their spouse, and you take a step back and begin building your own life, which is what I'm doing. So this reaffirms for me that this is the right road of where I am. So then next, the part that stood out to me, no, sweetie. She wants to read. No, you can't read. So then the next thing that steps out to me is the fall of man. So of course, it's when the serpent comes to Eve and he starts prying her away from God and tempting her to sin by doing exactly what God told her what not to do. And then, and this, when the serpent talks about the temptation, the words delight to the eyes, I visualize that scene in my mind. And although I know that story, somehow with all this explanation of the Great Adventure Bible, it brings it to life. It's just not an old story. It relates to my life and how I've been tempted to sin at times in my life. So it kind of brings it to me. And the next thing that stood out was that God was walking in the garden. Oh, in the cool of the day. I don't know why, but that just blew me away. After reading all that and setting myself up and getting ready for it, it made me ripe to feel that and to just see the awesomeness of it. And the next thing that stood out were the words, the first words that God spoken. And what are they? Where are you? Where are you? Where are you? I just cannot tell you how that hit me in the gut. It really blew me away. And because after the temptation and then the sin, it goes into next. What do? We hide from him. We hide from God. And that's why most of the time people aren't paying attention to him. They don't want to face the fact of their sins. That's why people are scared of confession. Me too. And that's why it hit me in the gut, I think, because of course I have done that. I'm human, as I'm sure you have. And what else did I do with my sin? Well, the next thing that stood out to me is Eve begins to make excuses. Stop that. She just wants to play. She begins to make excuses. The serpent beguiled me. He beguiled me and I ate. And strangely enough, that was always a word that I love, a word that I love. I know that sounds weird, but I'm a big reader and I have words that I love and words that I don't, so I've always loved that word. And there were just some words that I love and now it just hits me in a whole different way. I don't know if I love it so much. Would you stop that? Get your head out from under the Bible. And stop. She just wants to play with whatever I'm doing. And then, of course, the punishments come. And I think about the pain of my sins. See, he goes into the punishments. And like Jeff Cavins explains, would you stop? First, God doles out the serpent's punishment, and he ties that into Mary and the crushing of the serpent's head. And that just came alive to me. So he doesn't really, Jeff Cavins says, he goes after the serpent, which it comes, the serpent's punishment, and he ties that into Mary and the crushing of the serpent's head. And that just came alive to me because he had explained that. So again, it comes back to my own sin and my chance for salvation because of Mary's yes and Jesus' sacrifice. And I just, and when I was doing this, I said to myself, I opened my heart. That's what you had to do. That's why praying is so important, because by the time you get into all this, you are like, you're ready. Like you've been sort of, I don't really know how to put it into words. You've been sort of primed or something, so that this hits you in a different way than just reading it straight, because I just don't know how to explain it, but just do it and you'll understand. And that's why I wanted to do it all in one sitting, so that I would, and not in pieces. You can't do, of course, the whole thing in one sitting, but each period. And then the next thing that stood out to me was the cherubim and the flaming sword. The guard the way of the tree of life. So that's where the door was shut and that we die. That was sort of a sadness that I felt. that we were thrown out of the Garden of Eden because of sin. And again, we all know that, but there's just something about reading these words in context that makes it so much more meaningful, having that background, having that being primed for it. So then it gets into Genesis for what and what stood out, Genesis with Cain and Abel. And what stood out to me is when the children were born, Cain and Abel, the way Eve announces her firstborn in the Bible here is, I had gotten a man with the help of the Lord, because of course she and Adam are mother and father, but she had that child with the help of the Lord. And I thought of my own children. And again, and this is where I was feeling grateful. I felt so grateful. So then moving on to the next thing that stood out to me was Cain's anger. His anger. The first time in the Bible it showed God knew he was angry, and by his countenance, which is facial expression. And I've heard that in our Rosary Reflections from Father Dwight Longenecker's intention from his book, Praying Spiritual Warfare with the Rosary. So I say that word several times a week, but seeing it in this context as the first time anger is seen in the Bible is just sort of a moment of wow. And then God's second words spoken in the Bible are another question. So why are you angry? And then God goes on to give warning to Cain. And the words that God uses is sin is lurking at the door. And that just gave me chills. And of course, Cain didn't listen to the warning. And the next words that hit me, the ground opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. Really, that just amazed me. Not just because those are words of God, but the actual words used that just paint a picture in your mind. It's these words were written so long ago, and this is what God said. It's just profound. And then as the beginning of civilization start to take place after Cain and Abel. They go through a bunch of generations of Cain and Abel's children and grandchildren, and they come to particular names and families breaking off into brothers and cousins and all that. And they mention one particular family dwells in tents and have cattle, and then another family who plays musical instruments and forge instruments of bronze and iron. And it just came out to me how we're all born with certain talents to use in building the kingdom of God's, into building God's kingdom. So I get over to Genesis 6, where the wickedness, and of course up here is that, the flood part. And of course that was good, obviously. And God said he decided to make an end to all flesh because it's filled with violence. And but he believed Noah was different. He had a soft spot for Noah. So he told Noah exactly how to protect himself and build an ark. And that made me realize he also has told all of us how to protect ourselves by following his laws. So that was just really, that all hit me. So the next thing that stood out were all these numbers. Let's see. All these numbers. The second month on the 17th day, when the flood started. So I wondered, was that February 17th? And I found that interesting. And the next date I saw was the waters abated in the 7th month on the 17th day of the month. So that was that July 17th. And then the next number is the waters continue to go down until the 10th month on the first day of the 10th. So again, is that October 1st that the mountains were seen? And so that made no sense to me because that was 8 months and that didn't jive with what I thought I knew. But then the next date that stuck out to me was in Genesis 8:13. It said the year 6001. Or 600, one, the first month and the first day. So would that be January 1st, 6001? So as we all know, and these are of course AD, or no, before Christ, so BC. So we all know the years in the Bible are different and a little bit confused because they evidently measured things different back then. Even when he told Noah how to build the ark, it was in cubits, and I don't think we use those anymore. So those dates and their way of measurement, that just was like, wow, I wish we could figure all that out. So, I'm sure that the theologians have to some degree, but I can look more into that, and it pulls me more into the story because it's interesting. So then the next thing that stands out to me in Genesis 9 are words of God again. And so he, after he brings him out of the flood, he says, whoever sheds the blood of man by man, how does it say? Whoever sheds the blood of man by man shall his blood be shed. And that brought out to me that proverb in Matthew, whoever lives by the sword, you will die by the sword, live by the sword, die by the sword. Sorry. So now this is all setting us up, just so fascinating, and I wouldn't know that otherwise. Reading this would just be dry reading, but knowing all of this prime that set us up, it gives me that. God tells him, the next thing that stands out is when God tells him the sign will be a bow in the clouds, the rainbow. And it occurred to me how we all know that symbol, and why that's been hijacked in sin. We know why Satan wants to take that, because God said in this part of Genesis 9 that this is the sign of the covenant, which I've established between me and all flesh that is upon earth. All flesh. We all know that promise, that covenant from our Father, and it's about sin and violence. So it makes sense why Satan wants to hijack that sign. So then there are 2 pages, well, it's a page and a half talking about the covenant with Noah, and that really drives that home, because Jeff Cavins puts where in the catechism that ties into the church. So again, that's fascinating. And something interesting that stood out toward the end of that part with the covenant is Noah is the Jewish understanding, and how the Jewish people believe that they have a different set of laws, much longer than the ones that we Gentiles are expected to follow. And then he ties into the covenant and how into the New Testament, and that's just amazing. So the last 2 parts are 10 and 11, and we have the key event, and he tells you that, of Babel, and I read that to the end. And the only thing that really stood out to me here was when the devil is among us, there's a lot of confusion, like the Tower of Babel. So that was my reflection on the book of Genesis, and I know it's quite long. We'll move on the next time to the patriarchs and the second of the 12 periods. So that was day 1 of my challenge.